Ibnu Santoro is taken to this interrogation center, only a few hundred meters from his house. Here he is detained and tortured.
Kalau ditahan di situ, kemudian tiap hari dia datang mengantar makanan, minuman, pakaian, juga rokok. Setelah itu, kemudian selang beberapa bulan, ya, itu kita mau ke sana, sudah dikatakan bahwa Ibnu Santoro sudah tidak ada di situ lagi.
Ibnu is taken on a 4-hour drive with 22 others. One of Ibnu's fellow prisoners on the truck manages to write a list of everyone's names on the journey that day. He persuades one of the soldiers to draw a map of their final destination, which makes it back to relatives. Ibnu is taken to a forest near the village of Kaliwiro, where a hole has been prepared. Here he is shot in the back of the head. Seven weeks after the murder of the generals, Communist Party chairman Aidit is finally captured in Central Java. He's forced to sign a confession and is then executed on General Suharto's personal orders. The once invincible President Sukarno is now powerless to prevent the wholesale slaughter unfolding in his country. General Suharto and the army now plan his downfall and the complete takeover of government. The military arms civilian death squads and supervises further mass killings. This man was part of a Muslim militia gang in East Java in 1965.
Sometimes, all the students were collected in a certain place and then instructed by a certain leader from the army, and they distribute to us a number of people, and ask us to kill them. So we know exactly that this is organized.
The U.S. provided secret financial assistance.
I saw many broken bodies and many pieces, torsos, legs, arms, floating in the canals. And this went on day after day, night after night. Hundreds of them.
Although there were several journalists inside Indonesia filing reports, the true story of a one-sided slaughter did not immediately reach the Western public.
I reported many interviews of catastrophic occurrences, but a lot of them didn't see the light of day in newspapers.
I wrote a daily file for Time magazine, and I also sent reports to the BBC and to NBC News. Most of my material was going through other journalists who were staff people in Singapore, and they would edit my stories, discard my stories because they didn't believe them. It's incredible that they could second guess and kill my stories that I was gathering on the spot.
In the mid-1960s, at the height of the Cold War in Southeast Asia, stories that might engender sympathy for communists were not welcome. In this context, most newspapers and broadcasters reported the Army's death squads as engaged in a civil war.
There really was no sense that there was a centrally organized slaughter of alleged communists. It was being presented from all directions as a sort of running battle going on between, you know, organized communism and an organized army. It was a cleaning up operation. It was not a slaughter. The word slaughter didn't pass anyone's lips at that time. The scale of it was not understood.
On the island of Bali, the army laid the groundwork for communal butchery. Propaganda teams toured the countryside, spreading stories of PKI plans for women to seduce and castrate soldiers to obtain weapons. There was a deadly choice. You either took part in crushing the communists, or you were one of them.
I was told by General Solwa, Eddie, that whereas his boys, as he put it, had to encourage and stimulate the killing in Java, the killing in Bali was so intense that they had to stop it. They had to put a stop to it.
Di sini banyak sekali orang dipotong. Saya sendiri, saya nggak tahu, saya nggak sengaja bicara. Ketemu saya orang dipotong, saya begini. Nih kenapa anaknya si salah, saya menangis, saya sama anak saya baru saya nangis. Kenapa nangis? Nanti dipotong. Tetangga saya digalaki. Kenapa nangis orang dipotong? Ketagihan potong. Ya boleh saya potong.
Today, the tourist brochures sell Bali as an exotic paradise. They don't mention that 80,000 people were butchered here in the space of only 2 weeks. From the West point of view, the bloodbath had begun as an opportunity to see an end to Sukarno and the communists. Some news organizations outside Indonesia were instruments for broadcasting Western propaganda into Indonesia.
Of course, Radio Australia worked closely with the Foreign Affairs Department in Canberra and got advice or guidance, let's put it that way, got guidance from the department as to what it should say in its broadcasts. From time to time that guidance wasn't followed, but mostly it's true to say it was followed.
The BBC's reputation amongst listeners in Indonesia was high, and at a time when the Indonesian people would feel that they could not rely on their own media, they of course are going to be leaning on what they regard as reliable sources, BBC, Radio Australia and so forth. I think there's no question whatsoever that we were all manipulated. I think probably the manipulation was being orchestrated by Norman Redaway, but I've no doubt that he too was also a part of an organisation in which the Indonesians played their part, the Americans certainly played their part.
Six months after the murder of the generals, hundreds of thousands of communists and their alleged supporters lay dead. General Suharto's troops surround Sukarno's palace, causing him to flee by helicopter. Later that day, President Sukarno is forced to sign a letter which hands the power of the presidency to General Suharto. Suharto immediately uses the letter to arrest 13 members of President Sukarno's cabinet and to legitimize the slaughter of suspected communists.
Jelas dan kita semua tahu bahwa kekacauan dan ketegangan sekarang ini disebabkan karena PKI. Saya menggunakan surat perintah ini untuk membubarkan Partai Komunis Indonesia.
Dikiranya SP 11 Maret itu satu transfer of sovereignty, of authority. Padahal tidak.
Despite President Sukarno's objections, General Suharto had effectively wrested control of the Indonesian state. His takeover was reported as a gentlemanly affair in the London Observer and welcomed in the New York Times, which hailed Suharto as a gleam of light in Asia.
I welcomed the Suharto regime, and most of the journalists did. It was the first time order had been seen in Indonesia for about 10 years. The Economist in early to mid-1966 started peddling the US line that Indonesia was safer under a disciplined rule. That certainly was true. It was safer. But to deny the level of destruction and the human tragedy that had taken place seemed to me quite idiotic.
The majority, I think, of the press was looking the other way. You know, there was no condemnation of it, I think. It was kind of tolerated and accepted. In fact, kind of welcoming that Indonesia was joining the fold of the anti-communist movement.
The Indonesian domino ultimately fell on the western side of the Cold War divide. Compared with getting bogged down in Vietnam, it was seen as a clear victory for anti-communism and for President Lyndon Johnson. Visiting Vietnam later in 1966, LBJ was to invoke Indonesia as a rallying point. He told US troops that their exploits were the reason why people in Indonesia were enjoying freedom that they didn't previously have. But in reality, it would be more than 3 decades before Indonesia would taste political freedom and freedom of speech. Now, after General Suharto has fallen, Indonesians can finally question his official version of their history. Like Professor Arif Budianto, the forensic pathologist who in 1965 was called to examine the bodies of the dead generals.
I got 3 bodies to examine. Not a single one of the bodies do we find the penis slice. Or we had signs of torturing, we don't find. Nobody is glad to sign our reports because the newspapers, they wrote already about the torturing. They said the penis too, they cut it off and then they throw it. They play with that, the Garwanis women.
Professor Budianto's autopsy report was suppressed under the orders of General Suharto. Many Western journalists accepted the lurid story without question.
Terror and bestiality was a calculated part of the PKI plan. They even had special mutilation squads made up of girls. Sex orgies went on before the torture ceremonies got underway. Eventually, the mutilated bodies were dumped down a well.
This monument was built at the place where the generals' bodies were dumped down the well.
This is what pains me most, to see the women here, because I spent several years together with women who had been tortured to confess that they had perpetrated sexual crimes against the bodies of these generals. And of course we know that that was not true. Their confessions were published in the newspapers. And this was perhaps the most important propaganda weapon that Suharto used to send people out and kill members of our suspects, communist suspects, family, everything. Ini dia umur berapa? 10 juga? Kecil. Dan ini juga 10? 12. Kenapa dibawa ke sini?
Jalan-jalan aja.
Hah?
Mau lihat pahlawan. Mau lihat sejarah.
Oh. Tapi gurunya bilang ini betul apa yang dilihat sini?
Betul.
Ya. Tapi sebetulnya banyak bohong di sini. Banyak hal yang diuraikan di sini di diorama itu tidak benar. Karena saya dulu juga kenal dengan wanita-wanita yang dikatakan begini, tapi mereka tidak berbuat begini. Jadi ini banyak sekali bohong di sini.
Gimana maksudnya bohong?
Soeharto itu berkuasa. Jadi dia membuat ceritanya sendiri apa yang terjadi di sini supaya orang benci sama PKI.
Dulu kan suka itu putar 31 September.
Ya.
Itu filmnya itu benar apa enggak itu?
Tidak benar.
Ya.
Banyak bohong. They say here these killings shouldn't be repeated. What happened after this was not 6 people being killed, but more than 600,000 people killed. And these are the people I'm thinking of now, because I think they deserve a monument for the way in which they were killed.
Military courts put more than 1,000 people on trial for the murder of the generals. There were no acquittals. The courts ruled that the Indonesian Communist Party was the sole puppet master behind the murders. Over 70 death sentences were handed down for the crime of having prior knowledge of the plan. But it's far from clear who else had prior knowledge of the plan to kidnap the generals. True responsibility is variously attributed to President Sukarno, General Suharto, and Western intelligence agencies. The only leader of the 30th of September movement left alive is Colonel Latif, who survived 33 years in prison. He claims he informed General Suharto of their plans, and Suharto has admitted meeting with him.
Malam itu sudah ketemu sama Suharto, memberitahu kalau paginya akan dihadapkan para jenderal sama Bung Karno. Karena semua sepakat Harto dianggap loyal sama Bung Karno.
Those who see the hand of Suharto say it was his agents who infiltrated the 30th of September movement to make sure the generals were killed that fateful night. The rebel soldiers maintained it was never their intention to kill the generals. Their intention, they said, was to bring them before President Sukarno to face charges of planning a coup against him. President Sukarno was put under house arrest for his supposed involvement. He died a broken man in 1970. But what of the role of Western intelligence agencies? Omar Dani, head of the Air Force, received a death sentence for his foreknowledge. Released after more than 30 years in detention, he clings to a view that many Indonesians like to believe.
I think that the CIA is fully involved. And Suharto cannot do that because at that time, I don't think that not one general has the capacity to arrange such an intricate and so complicated operations.
As CIA station head at the time, Hugh Tovar denies the CIA had any involvement in the conspiracy.
In my time, 64, 5, and 6, the CIA was never told to do any such thing. The CIA was sent out there to collect intelligence and report it to headquarters and to tell us what in the name of heaven is going on in that crazy country. You know, that's the way it was. And if the audience can't take that at face value, there's nothing I can say that's going to convince them.
What is fully established is that Britain and the US gave extensive support to the army immediately after the murder of the generals, including providing weapons. The full extent will not be revealed until all the documents have been declassified, which could take many decades. For years, American diplomats strenuously denied providing lists to the Indonesian army, until recent declassifications revealed the truth.
There were lists going around. I don't know who compiled them, but the theory was they're the people who are going to be extirpated next. So clearly there was a method and an organisation behind it all.